The war did not truly end with victory parades or signed documents. It ended in quiet rooms like this one. In the winter, after the guns fell silent, a former German general sat alone in a borrowed villa overlooking the cold waters of Lake Geneva. The Reich he had served was gone. The uniforms, the banners, the certainty, burned away. What remained was memory, and memory, unlike nations, does not surrender. Across from him sat Allied historians, notebooks open, waiting for judgment, not confessions, not apologies. Something far more dangerous, honesty. When the question came, what did you really think of the British commander who defeated you? The old general did not answer right away. He closed his eyes, not in anger, not in shame, but in calculation, as if replaying the war one last time in his mind. We knew him, he finally said, better than he knew us. That single sentence should stop you cold, because history tells us what generals claimed after the war, what speeches said, what medals implied, but it rarely tells us what the enemy truly believed, when no one was listening, when there was nothing left to gain. The German generals who survived were not defeated amateurs. They were professionals. They had faced disaster, brilliance, arrogance, and genius on every front of Europe. And when they spoke about this British commander, methodical, calm, almost stubbornly patient, their words carried a weight no victory speech ever could. They did not speak with hatred. They spoke with something far more unsettling, respect without fear. And that contradiction, how a man could be respected by his enemy, yet never truly feared, would shape how the final year of the war unfolded and how countless lives were spent or saved. If you want to hear the war told from the other side of the table, from the men who planned against him and lost, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Your support is what allows us to keep uncovering stories, history books, only whisper about. Later that same afternoon, when the formal questions had run dry, General Karl Weissenberg did something the historians did not expect. He rose from his chair without a word. The room fell still. Weissenberg was an old soldier by then, his movements slowed by age and old wounds. Yet as he began to walk, there was nothing uncertain about him. He moved forward in a straight line, each step measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His eyes remained fixed downward, as though the polished wooden floor were a minefield only he could see. He walked slowly, painfully slowly. No one interrupted him. No one dared. When he reached the far end of the room, he stopped, turned, and faced the observers. Only then did he speak. That, he said quietly, is how he advanced. There was no bitterness in his voice, no mockery, only precision. For years, German headquarters had studied the British commander not through speeches or headlines, but through patterns, maps layered upon maps, timelines marked in pencil. They noticed that his movements never rushed ahead of preparation, that his attacks arrived only after silence, long, heavy silences, during which nothing seemed to happen. To the German mind, trained on speed and sudden decision, this was deeply unsettling, not because it was bold, but because it was immovable. You could not provoke him into error. You could not lure him into haste. He would come forward exactly when he decided, not a moment sooner. Weissenberg later explained that the walk mattered more than any sentence he could have spoken. Words could be misunderstood, gestures could not. That slow advance captured everything the Germans believed about the man who opposed them. Cautious, controlled, relentlessly intentional. They did not see hesitation in those steps. They saw discipline. And discipline, when paired with resources and time, can be more dangerous than brilliance. To the German officers tracking the British front, Montgomery did not appear like a man at war. He appeared like a man arranging furniture before guests arrived. Days passed, sometimes weeks. The front lines barely moved, yet behind them, everything did. Roads thickened with supply convoys. Artillery crept forward in careful increments. Airfields multiplied, their runways carved out with quiet determination. To impatient eyes, it looked like paralysis. To German planners, it was something far more unsettling. Intention. General Karl Weissenberg later admitted that Montgomery never reacted to events. He absorbed them, while others chased opportunity. Montgomery waited until opportunity came to him, fully measured and safely contained. He believed that disorder was not an inevitable companion of war, but a failure of leadership. German doctrine prized the sudden decision. The commander who seized the moment before the enemy understood what was happening. Montgomery inverted that logic. He made sure the enemy understood exactly what was coming, and ensured they could do nothing about it. This was not caution born of fear. It was control born of conviction. Montgomery had studied the limits of his own army with brutal honesty. He knew what his forces could do well, and more importantly, what they could not. Speed was uncertain. Improvisation was risky. Firepower, preparation, and coordination were reliable, so he built his battles the way an engineer builds a dam, layer by layer. Over time, with no room for collapse, when the attack finally came, it did not seek brilliance, it sought certainty. The Germans learned to read these patterns like weather. Silence meant gathering strength. Delay meant reinforcement. And when Montgomery moved, it was because every variable he could control had already been bent in his favor. He did not hurry toward victory. He constructed it, slowly, deliberately, and without apology. Among German commanders, the word predictable carried a sharp edge. It was never meant as praise. It meant the enemy could be anticipated, measured, prepared for. It meant the battlefield could be shaped in advance. When German intelligence officers spoke about Montgomery, that was the word they returned to again and again. His offensives followed a rhythm so consistent it could be plotted weeks ahead of time. Heavy bombardment, methodical advance, consolidation, pause, repeat. General Karl Weissenberg understood what this offered and what it denied. Predictability stripped war of surprise, but it also stripped it of chaos. Montgomery did not seek to disorient his opponent. He sought to exhaust him. He forced the Germans into a grinding contest where brilliance mattered less than endurance. Yet predictability was a double-edged weapon. Because Montgomery's plans unfolded exactly as expected, German defenses could be layered with equal care. Reserves were placed not in panic, but with patience. Countermeasures were prepared long before the first British unit moved forward. Weissenberg later noted that against Montgomery, there was no need for desperate intuition. There was time to think, time to adapt, time to wait. This did not mean Montgomery was ineffective. Far from it. His predictability denied the Germans the chance to regain initiative through daring action. It kept the front stable, controlled, and increasingly costly for both sides. But it also meant that when opportunity flickered, when the enemy was unbalanced, when a rapid thrust might have changed the shape of the war, Montgomery rarely seized it. He preferred certainty over possibility. The Germans did not mock this choice. They simply recognized it. In war, they believed, unpredictability creates fear. Predictability creates respect. Montgomery earned the latter completely. The former, never. General Karl Weissenberg believed that to understand Montgomery, one had to look backward, not forward. The British commander, in his view, was shaped less by the war he was fighting than by the one his nation could never forget. For Britain, the First World War was not history. It was memory, etched into families, towns, and entire generations. The slaughter of men sent forward by the thousands, only to gain yards of mud, had left a permanent scar. Montgomery carried that scar into every decision he made. Weissenberg observed that Montgomery planned as if haunted, not by defeat, but by waste. He measured success, not by how much ground was taken, but by how many lives were preserved. Every delay, every careful buildup, was an argument against the past, a refusal to repeat what Britain had already paid for in blood. The Germans recognized this instinct immediately. Many of them had been young officers in the trenches decades earlier. They understood what it meant to survive a war and then be forced to fight another one, with those memories still burning. Yet memory is a dangerous advisor. It teaches caution, but it also narrows vision. Montgomery fought with one eye fixed firmly on the last war, and the other cautiously scanning the present. What he refused to do was leap into the unknown. To the Germans, this made him understandable. It also made him limited. There were moments when the enemy was vulnerable, when speed might have shattered resistance entirely. Montgomery saw those moments and chose not to trust them. In his mind, the greatest failure was not missing opportunity. It was repeating catastrophe. And so the ghosts of the past stood quietly beside him, shaping a war that would be won carefully, slowly, and without forgetting the cost of being wrong. Over time, General Karl Weissenberg and his fellow planners came to a sobering realization. Against Montgomery, they were not fighting for victory in the traditional sense. They were fighting against erosion. Montgomery did not seek the dramatic collapse of German lines. He aimed for something quieter and far more destructive: exhaustion. His battles were designed not to break the enemy's spirit in a single blow, but to wear down their strength until resistance became unsustainable. German reports began to reflect this grim understanding. Fuel shortages grew chronic. Replacement units arrived under strength. Equipment that once could be repaired was now abandoned. None of this happened suddenly. That was the cruelty of it. The front did not explode. It thinned. Weissenberg noted that Montgomery forced the war into a contest the Germans could not afford to sustain. Britain and its allies possessed deeper reserves, stronger industry, and secure supply lines. Montgomery turned those advantages into a slow-moving weapon, advancing only when his weight could not be resisted. Yet this method carried a heavy emotional cost. Battles stretched on longer than anyone wished. Soldiers on both sides felt trapped inside a war that refused to end. There was no decisive moment to hope for, only another day of pressure. The Germans understood they were being crushed not by brilliance, but by arithmetic. They could still fight. They could still counterattack. But every exchange favored the side that could replace losses more easily. Montgomery accepted this reality without illusion. He was willing to trade time for certainty, knowing that time itself was the one resource Germany no longer had. In doing so, he ensured victory. But at the price of a war that ended not with a single moment of collapse, but with the quiet realization that there was nothing left to give. Among the German generals who studied Montgomery, a clear distinction emerged, one that General Karl Weissenberg articulated with unsettling calm. "We respected him," he said, "but we did not fear him." In war, respect and fear are not the same currency. Fear paralyzes. It forces mistakes. It steals sleep and certainty. Respect, on the other hand, allows planning. And Montgomery, through his consistency, gave the Germans something invaluable: the confidence that he would not surprise them. They trusted him to secure his flanks, trusted him to halt rather than risk overextension, trusted him to value order over impulse. This trust did not come from admiration, but from experience. Again and again, Montgomery chose consolidation when others might have pressed forward. That caution saved his army. His forces were rarely encircled. Catastrophe never defined his campaigns. British units endured where others might have been shattered. To the Germans, this was proof of competent, disciplined leadership. But safety has a shadow. There were moments when German defenses wavered, when exhaustion had created cracks that speed might have torn open. In those moments, Montgomery slowed. He waited. He chose assurance over acceleration. The Germans felt relief when this happened. Relief, not joy, because a commander who waits gives his enemy time to recover. Weissenberg later reflected that Montgomery fought as though his first duty was not to defeat the enemy, but to preserve his own army intact for tomorrow. That instinct was understandable. It was also limiting. Montgomery denied the Germans chaos, but he also denied himself opportunity. His caution prevented disaster with remarkable consistency. It also allowed the war to continue longer than it might have otherwise. In the end, the Germans did not curse this trait. They simply learned to depend on it. There was one moment, General Karl Weissenberg recalled, when Montgomery stepped outside the boundaries of his own nature. It caught the Germans off guard, not because it was brilliant, but because it was unfamiliar. The plan was ambitious. Speed mattered. Timing mattered. Coordination mattered above all. It depended on momentum continuing, uninterrupted, on assumptions holding firm under pressure. For a commander known for removing uncertainty from war, this was an extraordinary risk. At first, German headquarters struggled to believe it. Weissenberg admitted that when reports arrived describing the scope of the operation, the reaction was disbelief. "This is not how he fights," one officer remarked. But when captured documents confirmed the design, that disbelief turned into calm confidence. The plan left no room for improvisation. There was no alternative route, no margin for friction. And friction, as every soldier knows, is war's most reliable companion. When resistance appeared, as it always does, Montgomery's system revealed its limits. Units halted to await orders. Timetables slipped. Momentum drained away not in dramatic collapse, but in slow hesitation. The Germans did not need to counterattack aggressively. They only needed to obstruct, delay, and endure. Weissenberg later reflected that the gamble failed not because it was reckless, but because it demanded a kind of command culture Montgomery had never cultivated. Bold plans require subordinate initiative. They require officers trained to act without instruction when circumstances change. Montgomery's army had been trained for precision, not improvisation. The irony was unmistakable. When Montgomery fought within his method, he was nearly unstoppable. When he tried to escape it, he lost the one advantage that had always defined him: control. Afterward, he returned to caution. So did German expectations. That brief gamble did not redefine Montgomery. It confirmed him. Years after the war, when the maps had yellowed and the arguments had hardened into doctrine, General Karl Weissenberg was asked one final question. If history stripped away flags, speeches, and loyalty, how would he judge Montgomery? He answered carefully. Montgomery, he said, was not a commander who sought admiration. He sought responsibility. He carried the weight of every decision as though it would follow him for the rest of his life, and perhaps it did. He never allowed his army to be destroyed. He never lost control of a front. In a war defined by catastrophe, that alone was extraordinary. The Germans recognized this achievement. They understood what it meant to preserve an army under relentless pressure. They respected Montgomery for refusing to gamble with lives when certainty was still possible. But respect is not the same as awe. Weissenberg believed that Montgomery fought to survive history, not to end it. His caution ensured there would always be a British army tomorrow. But it also meant tomorrow came again and again. Weeks became months. Months became years. The war moved forward, but never leapt. To the German mind, shaped by initiative and sudden decision, this was both admirable and frustrating. Montgomery denied them chaos. He denied them opportunity. But he also denied the war a decisive conclusion when it briefly lay within reach. That is why historians still argue about him. Was he the general you wanted when the cost of failure was unacceptable? Or was he the general who prolonged suffering by refusing to risk everything? Through enemy eyes, Montgomery emerges neither as hero nor villain, but as something rarer, a man who chose certainty over glory, survival over spectacle, and perhaps that is why his legacy remains unsettled. Because history often celebrates those who end wars, but it cannot forget those who made sure their armies lived long enough to see the end. When we step back from the battles, the maps, and the arguments, what remains of Montgomery is not a list of victories, but a philosophy of responsibility, through the eyes of his enemies. He emerges as a commander who understood something many leaders never fully grasp: that power is not measured only by how boldly you act, but by how carefully you decide when not to act. General Karl Weissenberg and other German officers never doubted Montgomery's competence. They doubted something else: whether caution could ever bring finality. Montgomery chose certainty over drama, control over impulse, survival over spectacle. He built victories slowly, deliberately, and at times painfully. His armies lived, his fronts held. Catastrophe never defined his command. In a century marked by reckless ambition and wasted lives, that restraint mattered. Yet restraint came with a cost. Opportunities passed. Wars dragged on. Suffering continued longer than it might have. Montgomery's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Doing the safe thing is not always the same as doing the decisive thing. Leadership is not a choice between right and wrong, but between competing responsibilities, each carrying consequences that echo long after the decision is made. For us today, far from battlefields, but surrounded by our own pressures, this lesson is deeply relevant. In our careers, our families, and our personal goals, we face the same tension. Do we wait until everything is perfectly prepared? Or do we act when the moment is imperfect, but fleeting? Montgomery reminds us that caution can protect what we value, but also that fear of failure can quietly extend struggles we wish would end. The challenge is balance, knowing when patience is wisdom, and when it becomes avoidance. So here's a question for you. What do you believe matters more in life? A. Protecting what you have, even if progress is slow. B. Taking bold risks to reach an ending sooner